you know, I'm going to be talking tomorrow, I understand, at 2:45 about adapting BioShock to a novel, and we could just talk about BioShock generally, and since there's some, you know, BioShockiness, and we're in BioShock coming here. I'm jet lagged, and that's a form of BioShock. I'm biologically shocked. I'm cerebrally out of tune, and that is a form of BioShock in itself. So also, I've worn a lot of hats. This one lately, but I've worked in television and movies, and I wrote some video game stuff. I wrote early Star Trek video games way back when I was relatively young. And I worked more recently with Telltale Games, helping them adapt Borderlands and offering some advice, which they ignored on some other things. But I was paid, so I didn't care. You know, I've worked in all the different kinds of storytelling, starting out with short stories and then broadening to novels, and then eventually, about the same time William Gibson and I met in Vancouver, and probably most of you know his name better than mine. He, you know, is the guy who coined the word cyberspace in his novel Neuromancer. Actually, I think it was in one of his short stories before that, but it's in Neuromancer, which is once more trying to become a movie, by the way. He just signed a deal, and I'm not allowed to say anymore. But if you're a fan of Neuromancer, I think this time there's a good chance that it'll be good, because there's a good director, and there's, you know, I think the imperative is there to do it now, and the possibility of the right graphics, the right special effects, the right computer graphics, and this time it won't matter that computer graphics look too much like computer graphics, because it's cyberspace, you know. So it won't matter that King Kong looks slightly, you know, too much like CGI, because there's no King Kong in it. But you know what I mean. So look forward to Neuromancer. Well, Gibson, of course, wrote many other books and is probably the most famous cyberpunk so-called writer. And he used to sleep on my sofa in Portland, Oregon, when he came into town, because we met at science fiction conventions, and he and I were the only two guys at the convention. Like, if somebody said Burroughs, we thought William Burroughs, not Edgar Rice Burroughs. Although we liked Edgar Rice Burroughs, we'd read him, but we thought William Burroughs, you know, Naked Lunch and so on. We were more oriented that way. You know, we had damage from Dadaism and surrealism and J.G. Ballard and Philip K. Dick, and we were also from psychedelics, and Gibson was at Woodstock, but he took the bad acid. This is true. This is true. He was like in one of those tents the whole time, where if you took the brown acid, go to the tent with the red cross on it and lay down. And as a consequence, he basically co-created Cyberpunk, because he took the bad acid at Woodstock. I think something is connected there. But it's also because of just his general interests. I mean, he was very into progressive, edgy, underground sort of writing, as well as the people who were real great storytellers in the 50s and 60s and 70s, in film noir and in noir novels. John D. MacDonald was a favorite of his, and the same with me, same with Sterling. We had this convergence of this parallel interest in noir stuff, and in noir, and in the writing that had fomented that, like from Raymond Chandler, you know, and Dashiell Hammett. And you know, in a lot of video games, whether or not you're familiar with those writers, so much is derivative of those people. The storytelling style is a derivative of Chandler and Hammett and James M. Cain. The Postman Only Rings Twice, right? So we were into that, and we were into weird, dark, progressive stuff, and you know, some of us had smuggled drugs, and some of us had done some extreme drugs, and we were survivors from those scenes rather than heavy participators in them when we met. And we were influenced by rock also, like the more, you know, Zappa and Jimi Hendrix, but also people like the Stooges, and especially Lou Reed. And the reason there's a Mirror Shades thing, and the reason the Mirror Shades book, this first cyberpunk anthology called Mirror Shades, is because, and the reason I'm wearing these partly because, besides that I wear them for my band now anyway, and I did when in the early days when I knew Gibson, was because Lou Reed wore glasses like this in his rock and roll animal phase, and Lou Reed was shooting amphetamines and bawling T-girls on the street, you know, and really walking on the wild side. In fact, he'd come from, you know, all that stuff, as well as just a grounding in an interest in poetry. He was a liberal arts student, and he was a big influence on us. Stuff like A Street Hassle by Lou Reed, for example, or Sally Can't Dance. You know, that sort of urban naturalism. That's very cyberpunk, and you see it again. You see it in a lot of science fiction and in video games and Deus Ex, and you know, like the grittier things in these sort of technology-based video game stories are all kind of influenced indirectly by the Velvet Underground and Lou Reed and Patti Smith, people like that. And melded seamlessly with that noir writing. And also I should mention espionage writing, like the deeper, smarter espionage writing, which you really see bubbling up in Deus Ex, by the way. And so I've told you who Gibson is, if you didn't already know, and you're going to hear more about him as Neuromancer comes out as a big movie. They made efforts to make like his things into movies. Like Johnny Mnemonic, I was at the screening of that. That wasn't his fault. It was based on a really good short story, though. So read the short story, Johnny Mnemonic. And I was at the screening with him, and he said, I don't know, what did you think of that? And I said, oh, it's going to be fine. You know, I just didn't want to rain on his parade, but he didn't write the script for it. It was loosely based on his story. And other things by him, the New Rose Hotel, a script that he and I worked on, and then they bought our script and trashed it and made that other really odd movie that you probably haven't seen.
What movie is that?
New Rose Hotel.
It's called New Rose Hotel?
Mm-hmm, yeah. And it's by, you know, that one director who was like, he did Bad Lieutenant and stuff. So we had, partly because of interest in his work, that was in Hollywood, and partly because we wanted to go there where the money was, where there was more money. Many writers over the decades, over the generations have been sometimes terminally damaged by that impulse. You know, famously Fitzgerald and people of that kind, people of that scene, you know, William Faulkner, people like that. So anyway, we went there to be damaged also, but also to get the paycheck. And we did get paid for various things, developing different things that mostly didn't get made. Like he got paid, Gibson got paid to make to write one of the Aliens movies. I think it was the third one. And the only thing they kept was that somebody had a tattoo of a you know, little scan symbol on your.
That was all they kept?
Yeah, from his
Very
script.
different. You
Yeah.
released that script at some point.
Yeah. Yeah, he released the script so you can see. His was like a kind of a political metaphor, and it was a lot more about the prisoners and their lives and the trap of their condition and so on. But they just threw all that out and made a very mediocre film. A lot of movies would have been better if they just made the first draft, by the way. It's not always the case, but it's often the case that they, you know, you have this inspired first draft, which actually before they see it, before it's an official first draft, it's been drafted many times usually. In the course of all this, I wrote the first 4 drafts of the movie The Crow. Anybody seen The Crow? I'm the one who found the comic book. I was looking for, well, I had been writing something called Angry Angel, and I tried to get it done as a comic book, and I sent it to Caliber, and Caliber Comics said, oh, we'd like this, but it's too much like something we have called The Crow. So I went to the comic book store, and I found it in a cutout bin of black and white indie comics. The Crow, and I read it. Wow, this is really cinematic. That's what struck me about it. And it's because James O'Barr, creator of The Crow, was into movies. He was into Kurosawa. He was into Japanese action films too, especially, and all kinds of movies. And he was into rock. He was a very big fan of Iggy Pop, which I was too, and I recognized all these Stooges references. All this time I was in rock bands on the side, and to me writing was my day job and rock bands was my real job. Now it's the other way around. So I just bonded with this comic, and I took it to a producer friend, and he and I came up with a treatment. It's just an outline, a sort of extended pitch, like 5 pages. But the comic book itself was the real treatment because it was already visual. It was like a movie right there. When you know, and comics don't always translate that easily into movies, but that one seemed to. It was like a what do they call it? You know, when they make a sort of little cartoon of the movie at the storyboard. Yeah, it was like a storyboard in itself. So we took that to Edward R. Pressman, who made Wall Street and all these other movies, a lot of which you've seen, or your parents did, and they made it, they optioned it, and they took it to Paramount, and Paramount made a deal, and all of this sealed the doom of Brandon Lee, who played the Crow. And was killed during the making of the movie, just because they were being too hurried about how they shot the scenes with weapons, and somebody left something stuck in a prop gun and put too big of a charge in the blank, and so it killed him. The actor Brandon Lee, son of Bruce Lee. So that bummed us out, but they finished the picture. It was almost done, and it is, I think, a classic of some kind. I'm not sure what kind, but it is itself sort of. It's sort of like it sort of would be a good double bill with Escape from New York, which is like very arty in a way and pulpy in another way. And that's what this is. It's where art and pulp come together. And that's where I've always worked anyway, you know, where art and pulp come together. So Gibson and I were you know, trying to clean up out of Hollywood, and it was really making us depressed, and it was paying us sometimes, but and there are whole areas, neighborhoods in Hollywood where there are big houses built by scripts that were people paid big money, and they never made the movie. But these guys used the money from their unmade movie to build a house. You know, so we were mostly there. Although I went on to write some television. I wrote a Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, and a bunch of other things. And Gibson was involved in an X-Files. He's got a credit on an X-Files, and I think they're going to make Neuromancer. So I'm mentioning all this because I've got this little thing I want to read to you, bits of. First of all, I had totally forgotten that Gibson wrote an introduction to my book, City Come A-Walkin', which was an early sort of prototype of certain kinds of cyberpunk. It preceded the big wave of cyberpunk, which was the main people in cyberpunk writing originally were William Gibson, Bruce Sterling, myself, Rudy Rucker, who's, you know, you should know his stuff if you don't. He's very much involved in kind of, he's always been involved in software, and he has a novel called Software. And Pat Cadigan, a woman, she wrote Sinners, Synners. She's a very brilliant woman. And Lou Shiner. In Newsweek, they had a little article about it, and that was the group that they named, and that's pretty much who it was. And it spun off all this stuff. There's even a new Cyberpunk video game, isn't there, called Cyberpunk or something like it?
Yeah.
Is it called that?
Cyberpunk 20...
Was that based on the RPG? Yeah. The old paper and dice RPG?
No, this is CD Projekt Red that made The Witcher. This is their next game.
Yeah, it has based on it, but it's based on the old
It's based on what? Based on a game. Based on another game.
Yeah.
It's a really old game. Like the 70s.
And now it's rebooting and
About 1990. I remember when it came.
1990? Okay, there's no way that they weren't stealing our stuff left and right, which is fine. That's fine. Everybody does that. That's fine. You can take ideas, and we're all influenced by stuff. But they should have hired somebody like me as a consultant. Then they would have gotten it even righter. I have been consultant on some things, but not on as much as I should have. City Come A-Walkin' is about this, the collective unconscious of a city in the future is threatened by the kind of dispersal of cities out through the world because of new technology that makes it unnecessary to be in one. And then somebody discovers each city has its own mind. Like there's a Washington, D.C. mind, and there's a New York City mind. It's the overmind of that city if you can locate it and connect with it. And it's a consequence of the drugs I had been taking previously, maybe, I'm not sure. But I was also in a very seamy part of San Francisco when I was inspired to write it, and was hanging with prostitutes, and I was very young at the time, so it's hard to visualize, but I worked as a male stripper, and in kind of related vocations to pay the bills, sometimes to buy equipment for my band or whatever, until in between paperback novels. So, City Come A-Walkin' was about a guy who's possessed by the mind of a city, and he gets the powers of a sort of, he can control things in the city. He can make all the lights go green where he wants them to, and all red where he wants them to, and even the lamps, the street lamps will smash down. And I predicted ATMs in that novel. They were not a thing yet. I predicted them, and I predicted the style of electronic transfer of coinage we have now, and things like Bitcoin. But it was also a sort of mystical novel and had this kind of magic realism feel to it. And it had, it had like transsexual prostitutes as characters in it, and it had a woman based on Patti Smith, who was kind of a hero of mine at the time. I was in touch. Her guitar player loved my novel. I'll just say that, if you know who he is. So Gibson wrote a introduction to a later version of this novel, a later edition, and just to give you a sense of he writes so colorfully about who I was at the time, and it kind of extends to other cyberpunk people. I'm going to read a little bit of what he wrote. It's just fun to hear too. I just rediscovered this, so I'm kind of thrilled by rediscovering it. Mr. Shirley is 35 at the time of this writing, so it was in the 80s, and alternately resembles actor William Hurt, and a caricature of William Hurt is drawn by Dr. Seuss. When we first met very nearly a decade ago, he wore a belt around his neck for performances in Portland punk clubs. I used to have a belt like as part of, I was in all these punk bands. I was the original lead singer of Sado Nation, which is a pretty big Pacific Northwest punk band. A genuinely savage outfit known as Sado Nation. In the daytime, he wrote science fiction. So that was my day job, writing science fiction. I still have the original submission to publishers when the story collection was to be called Wild Child, his first story collection. The publisher preferred the title Heat Seeker. It was a pile of photocopied short stories and a few unsold manuscripts, but this is my writing here in this part. The real treasure is the William Gibson intro, which is the original print from his dot matrix printer. Do you guys remember your parents' dot matrix printer?
I remember my dad matrix.
You really?
Worst things on the planet.
Gibson's original, his Neuromancer famously was written on a manual typewriter. It's true. And because he was a big fan, like I said, of detective novels, and he had this romantic image and lived up to it of Dashiell Hammett pounding away on his old Royal typewriter or whatever it was. Besides which, there were no computer PCs at the time. There were no PCs. So he wrote a Neuromancer on a manual typewriter, and then he made the big jump to dot matrix. And if you remember, dot matrix lettering was no blackboard, but it was like letters made out of dots, and you could see the dots clearly. And so it was kind of fuzzy looking, but it was like, to me, it always symbolized jumping into the cyber world, because it was words becoming pixelated in a way. Worlds were made out of dots, like something projected on a screen. And it was more of the way a computer thinks. And then later on, of course, lasers and everything were applied to printing, and that's good. But at the time, it just seemed poetic to me. And then finding this intro he'd written about me, written in dot matrix, really, then you get a sense of the original cyberpunk era. He says Shirley was cyberpunk's patient zero, a carrier. City come a walking is evidence of that. And the city avatars in City are precursors of sentient cyberspace and the AIs in Neuromancer. So Gibson said, that Oregon boy remembered today with a lank forelock of dirty blonde around his neck, a belt of some long extinct mode of patent elastication, orange pigskin, fashionably rotted to reveal cruel links of rectilinear chrome spring. There's some Gibson writing for you. Johnny Paranoid, and that's the name of a song that I did. It was our single, actually. Convulsing like a galvanized frog on the plywood stage of some basement coffee house. Was I impressed? You bet. I met Shirley as I was starting to write fiction, or rather I had made a start, had abandoned the project, was shamed back into it by this person from Portland, point man in a punk band whose day job was writing science fiction. Finding Shirley when I did was absolutely pivotal to my career. He seemed totemic. There he was, lashing these fictions together and propping them in the desert of the norm. You know, by the desert of the norm, I was writing really, really weird stuff. I mean, it was weird, but I managed to put it in a format that people could read, you know, commercially. So, anyway, I'm gonna skip the parts about me since people are leaving. Traditionally, cyberpunk is identified with the street having its own. This is some of my remarks about cyberpunk. It's the street having its own uses for technology. By the street, we mean the poor, the hustlers, criminals, the demi-monde, the disenfranchised. That's what we mean by it. But you know, in Silicon Valley, they mean by the street where you sell your shit. You know, you sell it to, you know, where you sell your smartphones. You know, you sell it in windows that are on the street. But to us, we meant the street. You know, people talk about law enforcement agencies using drones. Drones will also be used by drug dealers to watch for cops, and this has happened now since I wrote this a couple of years ago. You can order a good drone with a camera off the internet right now. So cyberpunk is a tone. It's an urban dystopian, but also having the courage to face the dystopian world thing. There's a transhumanist thing going on in it too. People merging with technology, and certainly Philip K. Dick was an influence on it. Cordwainer Smith, Samuel Delaney, John Brunner, Ballard. I'd say cyberpunk's influences also include non-genre writers like the Beat Writers, William Burroughs, edgy writers like Baudelaire and Rimbaud. Gibson and Sterling loved to listen to the band Sisters of Mercy together. And my cyberpunk trilogy is called A Song Called Youth, which is coming out again in October. It'll be back out in October in a new edition. It never quite went out of print anyway, but Dover Books is bringing it back starting in October. It's been updated a little bit. Well, anyway, I was asked to speak at a TED thing, TEDx actually, and
Is that the TEDx stuff that you're sifting through?
yeah. I've got one of my cyberpunk pieces. I was thinking of reading a piece of it, like a paragraph, but I don't know if you guys are up for it. But
By the way, so you know, people are leaving not because you're boring, but because MAGFest is extremely distracting.
yeah, it would be.
many
It would be.
things going on.
It would be. I'm used to it anyway. I'm used to science fiction conventions, and it's kind of like that too. Yeah, you know, I'll just read. This is from years ago. You know, I wrote this in the 80s, the late 80s. It became part of part of A Song Called Youth. And it's just about some guys who were in a jail cell and they're thinking their way out. The story's called Wolves of the Plateau. I'm not going to read, I'll just read like a paragraph or two of it. One of the remarks that strikes me here is the guy, Jerome had turned off his chip, you know, his implanted chip, because it was thinking endlessly about Jesse's plan, and all it came up with was an ugly model of risks. It is like where that really turns on is because he had to turn it off because it was thinking endlessly about this stuff. So you know, you come up with the clash of being human and technology in one, not necessarily negatively, just the reality of like the dynamic of it back and forth, you know. So Jerome's chip communicated with his brain via an interface of nanoprint configured rhodopsin protein. This was in the 1980s, by the way. The ribosomes borrowing new neurohumoral transmitters from the brain's blood supply, reordering the transmitters so that they carried a programmed pattern of ion releases for transmission across synaptic gaps to the brain's neuronal dendrites. I don't use language like that in writing for example, Bioshock Rapture, right? But they would have just crossed that out. The chip using magnetic resonance holography to collate with brain-stored memories and psychological trends, declaiming to itself the mythology of the brain, reenacting on its silicon stage the legends of his subjective world history. He closed his eyes and looked into the back of his eyelids, which is where he sees readouts in this case. That's the cheap way to do it. The digital readout was printed in luminous green across this darkness. He focused on the cursor, concentrated so it moved up to access. He subverbalized open frequency. The chip heard his practiced subverbalization. And you know what subverbal, okay. And numbers appeared on the back of his eyelids, and there's a string of numbers. He read them out to the others, and they picked up his frequency. And the others in the jail cell, all working on ways together to escape. And this is the metaphor of this story. These guys are all in jail together for illegal augmentation of their brains. There's illegal street augmentation, but they managed to hide a lot of their chips, just as people hide things when they go into jail now. And so they're using that very technology and communicating with it in a Wi-Fi method, which hadn't been created then per se, but I just call it open frequency. And they used it to figure out a way to get out of jail together, how to escape. And they eventually hack into there's one of those jail robots that now has appeared. They have them in Korea. They're using them in South Korea. In more and more of their prisons there. They look just like I describe it. It's really weird. They look just like, sort of like walking trash cans. It's like just something from Star Wars almost. And you know, they watch you and they provide things and they open doors and they lock doors and they report things and they shoot you down if you are a little too anomalous and so on. So they have to hack this thing to get out. So that's what will happen in the story. I won't get to that, but it opened the link, and he'd done it only once before. It was illegal, and he was secretly glad it was illegal because it scared him. They're holding the plateau back. His brain chip wholesaler had told him. The plateau is like the dark internet of this future. Before the internet, the internet didn't exist when I wrote this. So the plateau is where everybody communicated secretly who was in this illegal augmentation field in this story. They're scared of that, what worldwide electronic telepathy might bring down on them. I was just reading today about people, dying from ordering synthetic heroin all the time off the internet. But, like everyone, I mean in real life, I was reading that today. Like everyone will collate information, use it to see through the bastards' game, throw them out of office. That's what they're afraid of, his dealer said. Maybe that was the real reason. It was something the power brokers couldn't control, but there were other reasons. Reasons like the strikingly legitimate fear of people going mad. And so anyway, he's opened up for this guy, and they see each other more in a different way than I see you or you or you. They see with more information, and they see a kind of a holographic model that provides more really fast. And it's a sort of archetypal thing that it provides way more information just at a glimpse without having to decode it, because you'd have to read the story and it would take a while, but that's what it is. He saw Jesse as a grid and as a holographic entity. He braced himself when the holograph came at him, an abstract tarantula of computer-generated color and lines scrambling down over him, and for an instant it crouched in the seat of his consciousness. Jesse, Jesus Chaco, his real name. And he's seeing this Hispanic guy he's in the cell with. He's seeing him through this kind of cyberspace, this kind of alternate electronic reality. He was a patriarch, a protector of his wife and 6 kids, and his widowed sister's 4 kids, and of the poor children of his barrio. He was a muddied painting of his father, who had fled the social forest fire of Mexico's civil war between the drug cartels and the government, spiriting his capital to Los Angeles, where he'd sown it in the black market. Jesse's father had been killed defending territory from the Russian-American mob. Jesse compromised with the mob to save his father's business and loathed himself for it. See, he's picking up stuff this guy tries to hide normally, because there's a vulnerability of being connected on the plateau in this way. And it's just seeing all the guys, what I call his undersides, his weaknesses, his patriarchal adoration, or patriarchal, adoration and attitude toward his wife. Because it was like had really been imprinted by this by his father, the way his father had been. And then he sees another guy, this kind of white guy who's maybe somebody you might recognize in a sense. Jerome X on a video screen with lousy vertical hold, wobbling, trying to arrange its pixels firmly and losing them. A figure of mewling inconsequence, a brief flow of electrons that might diverge left or right like spray from a water hose. Raised in a high-security condo village, protected by cameras and computer lines to private security thugs, raised in a medio-windowed womb with PCs and VCRs and 1,000 varieties of video games, shaped by cable TV and fantasy rental, sexuality imprinted by sneaking his parents' badly hidden cache of brain sex files, and in stations from around the world, seeing the same star faces appear on channel after channel as the star's fame spread like a stain across the frequency bands. Becoming real himself in his own mind simply because he'd appeared on a few thousand TV screens through video tagging. Video tagging is something in the future where you get on CBS, you manage to hack it in a way that transmits a graffiti across it, in an image, and it's something I've been waiting to appear. Anyway, you see what I was visualizing then, and so much seems familiar now. It seems pretty prescient. Also, the novels, the cyberpunk novels, are anti-fascist novels. They warn about neo-fascism returning, which is a struggle not only here, we've seen it here in this country, but also in Europe right now. And a lot of the story is in Europe. When I was in Europe in the late 80s, the Front National was marching in the street, National Front, the French neo-fascists, Le Pen, and and that was her father that I saw, and she is now a force in France, and they came like 40% of the vote, something like that at their best, but neo-fascism, partly triggered, as predicted in my book, by immigration pressures, is making a comeback there, and it's a great danger to civilization. And I predicted it in a song called Youth Books. The first one's called Eclipse. And it's really actually starting to freak me out how much it's coming true recently. People have been remarking about it. And that might be why Dover Books decided to bring out this new edition. So I guess I give you a pretty good impression of what Cyberpunk's life was like for us in the early days, and where it came from, and what I was like when I was first in it, and what Gibson was like to some extent. If anybody wants to just say anything about anything related to anything that I said, or anything else that makes them happy, just go ahead or ask questions.
I got one. Curious, because obviously they were interrelated. How much did Blade Runner influence what was happening with Cyberpunk at the time? And how much was it, it was influenced by what was going on with Cyberpunk?
Well, it's kind of a complex thing, but a lot of Cyberpunk came before Blade Runner ever came out. And it was a little influenced by it. Gibson's short stories had come out before that movie. And then he was thinking of, he was writing Neuromancer. And then I went with him to the theater, and he left part way. He said, this is too much like the way it looked, mostly. And what the visuals. This is too much like what I'm writing, and it's going to affect me, and I'm not going to be able to write. And he left in the middle of Blade Runner. So that's how complex it is.
Right.
But he'd already written Johnny Mnemonic and things like that, and the short story.
He had written Johnny Mnemonic before.
Oh yeah. Plus which, Blade Runner is roughly based on a Philip Dick story.
Yeah.
And more than one Philip Dick thing, but mostly Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And so they borrowed from that too. And Philip Dick, big influence in everybody, in modern science fiction. It was writing about kind of all the big dilemmas of our world now. Man in the High Castle, that's Philip Dick. And what is that about? It's about a world where fascism was not defeated in World War II, as you know, but it's also about our world in other ways. It came about because the people who produced it were worried about how things were going even before Trump was elected. Philip Dick, he was an influence in the cyberpunk writers because he was pretty dark. And cyberpunk is innately pretty dark, and he often wrote about people who were just your ordinary regular guy struggling with things. I think a thing he influenced was the movie Brazil, the Terry Gilliam movie Brazil. It's sort of like I think that was a result of Gilliam's reading of Philip K. Dick. And so you can't leave Philip K. Dick out of Blade Runner, is what I'm trying to say. So, and then all this other stuff was coming together at the time, just a general dystopic view of the world. And how do you view that dystopic world cinematically and in an artful way? You come up with Blade Runner.
So what you're saying is it was sort of a simultaneous
it's
evolution thing.
Yeah, well, it was. Yeah, it was. I think Gibson's Cyberpunk's short stories influenced it, and Philip Dick.
Yeah.
But I think it kind of was Blade Runner time also, just generally.
To me, it's of anomaly, and nobody really did cyberpunk justice in film for another 15 years, until the late 90s hit. Right, and there was a lot of attempts, there was a lot going on, but it was all these terrible B movies and stuff.
Christopher Nolan's showing his crew how they're going to make the Dark Knight. I sat down and had a screening of Blade Runner and said, that's what we're going to do with this movie.
Oh, yeah?
Dystopian style, that concept, that
Mm.
disconnection from the giant world and the person in it.
Yeah.
To apply that to this movie, that's how we're going to make this form that is specific. It's like so memorize this film.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
And I feel like you mentioned Giant Mnemonic, and I think the best thing about the Giant Mnemonic film was that it made The Matrix way better.
Yeah.
The
It was,
Matrix expecting another one of those, and I was very
Mm.
pleasantly surprised.
In a way, one of the first major trans films, like altered carbon style, kind of applied, like jagged,
Right.
vanish.
the Matrix, the interesting thing, it's kind of almost a Jungian sort of vision or something. And it very, very paranoid, innately paranoid. We can all relate to that.
Ghost in the Shell, or Matrix, which has essentially they saw a ghost in the shell, and they,
Right.
and they told the company, they're like, we want to make this like live action essentially.
Oh,
Yeah.
That was part of what sold The Matrix. Was
Yeah,
they,
that
sort
was
of-
the
they
pitch.
showed people Ghost in the Shell, and then people got it.
when did Ghost in the Shell come out?
It was like 94.
Doesn't it go to like 92, I think.
Early 90s.
Okay, well, we all noticed that it was derivative of our work. You know, it was.
Right, and I feel
It
like
was derivative, I think, Bruce Sterling's stuff a lot. He wrote Schismatrix and some other books that,
yeah.
you know.
I feel like anime was getting it right in like the 80s and early 90s, but like American movies didn't catch on until sort of The Matrix was the breakthrough, and then all of a sudden that enabled tons
Well,
of
live action is also hard to translate too.
Right.
But animation is just, okay, we can do that.
Yeah.
Well, it's until you have computer graphics,
Yeah.
and then in the late 90s everybody had computer graphics to do everything. So anyway, that's interesting to hear that Gibson actually walked out of Blade Runner because it was too close.
It was the visuals of it that were, not the story.
Right.
Yeah?
My question is, a lot of times we see things popping up in culture many, many years after they've written about concepts of, right? And I wonder how often do you feel, or do you feel that you were responsible for that coming about?
You mean like a physical thing?
Yeah, like for example, the concept of cyberspace, as you brought out, right? That people are using cyberspace.
I think Gibson might have influenced the way that some visuals are organized in the internet.
But even in a sense of saying, like, this person might have made it, but you were the fathers who created the concept. You are
Sometimes a
someone
bit.
that looked at it and been like, that's cool. How do I do that? And then this young
Yeah.
person goes into college and their entire life is attached to this drive and that thing that was created.
We've heard that from people. We've heard that from people who made things that, you know, Rudy Rucker's ideas influenced some robotics persons. And he was a key cyberpunk writer. He wrote the Ware trilogy, software, wetware, and so on, and hardware. And I don't know. I think I influenced some people in the arts. There's a lot of, I kept trying to find ways to combine rock and roll and science fiction because I was in rock bands. And it's sort of like a lot of the rock and roll people didn't like it. They thought science fiction was corny. And a lot of the science fiction people didn't like it because they thought that the rock scene that I was describing was seamy and grimy and grimy chrome. But you know, I persisted in it, and I think it had some repercussions artistic repercussions in some people, in some artists. And some of it worked and some of it didn't.
Well, you wrote the book. Have you played the game?
Of course, I couldn't. I would never try to write a book where I hadn't played the game, except in the case I wrote a book inspired by the game Watch Dogs. Yeah, I had not played the game because it wasn't ready yet. They just showed me images from it. It wasn't released, and they wanted the book out, and so I wrote a book which they only brought out as an ebook. It's called Dark Clouds. That's their title. It's okay, but it's based on partly on their. These people send me breakdowns of characters. I got the same from the BioShock people because I needed their help as well as having played. I'll be talking about that tomorrow when I do this is the BioShock Rapture book I wrote. This is the little paperback of it, and I'll explain how you do that, and how much of it's me and how much of it's them. It's there's a lot of both, and there's conflict and drama in arguing with Ken about it, and the other people who were the creators of the thing, I think I came out with a good book eventually. I hope they do another Rapture story. I don't know if they are. Okay, that's it. I got to pee.